Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for tuning into Koshur Musalman. So, last time we talked about settler colonialism and some of its structures, some implications. Today we'll be talking about Fanon and Kashmir. So, for those of you who don't know Fanon, I'll just give a brief, quick introduction. So, Frantz Fanon, also known as Ibrahim Frantz Fanon, was a French West Indian psychiatrist. He was a political philosopher, and besides being an academic, he was also a member of Algerian National Liberation Front, and he actively supported and took part in the Algerian War of Independence from France. Now, as Kashmiris, when you study his work on colonialism, on decolonization, you would find a lot of ideas that you would relate, and you can draw parallels between his ideas and the many parallels between his ideas and the colonial situation that we are living under. But it's not possible for us to talk about all of those ideas in a single podcast. So we would be talking about some of them today. We'll be talking about settler colonialism and Fanon, how he views and understands settler colonialism. We'll be talking about Fanon and violence and the place he gives to violence in the process of decolonization. We'll also be talking about the nature of the colonizer and the colonized as described by Fanon. And towards the end, we would be briefly discussing Fanon and Islam, which is an interesting subject. So the first thing that Fanon tells us is that the settler owes the fact of his very existence to the colonial system. मतलब कश्मीर में रियल settlerian without complete support, socio-economic support, political support, military support, cultural support, without complete support of the Indian state, the settlers simply cannot exist. So one can say that the settlers would be an extension of the pre-existing colonial system. About this colonial system, Fanon tells us something very interesting. He says that this colonial system owes the fact of its very existence to violence and force. And without violence and force, the colonial system would simply collapse. He says that violence is the natural state of the colonial rule, and the colonial system owes its legitimacy to force. Kashmir mein agar is wucho, had it not been for violence, had it not been for oppression, the Indian occupation would not have lasted for all these years. Now, we have two things. We have the settler owing the fact of his very existence to the colonial system. And then we have the colonial system owing the fact of its very existence to violence and force. So one can safely conclude that the settler also owes the fact of his very existence to violence and force because it completely relies on the colonial system. So just like the inherent nature of the colonial system is that of violence, the inherent nature of the settler is that of violence and force as well. And it's going to breed violence and yield violence in the minds of the colonized people. Now Fanon brings our attention to the symbiotic relationship between the settlers and the colonial system. Fanon tells us that a colonizer seeks to be permanent. It wants to be permanent. The Indian state wants to be permanent in Kashmir. Hindustan ma shiyatsan zante Kashmir mazneerun. So how does it achieve that permanence? We have seen that through military occupation, achieving permanence is not possible, or it has not worked, because the Kashmiri Muslim society still stands. The values that govern this society still exist. And until this society exists, there's going to be hostility against the colonial rule. So the colonizer thinks and the colonizer realizes that it needs to replace this society with another society that would not be hostile to its colonial rule. So then the settlers come into equation. So the settlers represent, as per Fanon, the structural permanence necessary to and desired by the colonial system. Pacho as Fanon Vanake, there's a principle that the colonized people should keep in their minds. In the Algerian context, Fanon says that every European was a potential permanent resident or a potential settler. As to the principle panne zehnismas tha unke, every Indian from now on is a potential permanent resident or a potential settler for us. We cannot afford being credulous. We cannot afford being malleable. We have to be very cautious. So Fanon tells us that you see colonial system and you see settlers, they are in a mutually beneficial relationship. And there's a good example for this. In Palestine, the World Zionist Organization, and the Jewish National Fund, they used to buy large tracts of lands, and then they used to distribute these lands among the Jewish settlers. And they were allowed to possess, the Jewish settlers were allowed to possess these lands without any conditions. There was just one condition. And the condition was that you cannot return these lands to the original owners, that is, the Palestinians. We might see a similar pattern in Kashmir where large tracts of lands would be bought by the Indian state or the rich Indian nationalists, and then they would be distributed among the settlers. And ethnicity would be preferred over efficiency. The only thing that would matter would be that these lands should stay Indian and they should not be returned to the original owners, that is, the Kashmiri Muslims. We have another example that is relevant to us. The case of German colonizers in Southwest Africa, now called Namibia. Now, the German colonizers in Southwest Africa, they did not want to become like the local tribes. They did not want to imitate the values of the local tribes. Agar paga Kashmir mein settlerian, they don't want to integrate into our society. They don't want to imitate our values. Rather, they want to replace our society. They want to put an end to the values that govern our society. They want to put an end to the culture of our society. So these German colonizers in Southwest Africa, they wanted to recreate a mythical Germany. So they worked a lot and they came up with literature. And in this mythical Germany, there was a colonial desire. The colonial desire was to make themselves local while refashioning the colonized as threatening potential colonizers. Kashmir Mustichavichan is a similar pattern. Many Indian intellectuals and the Indian state in general, they have tried to recreate a mythical Kashmir in which the Hindu population is presented as the indigenous population, as the original inhabitants. Bayim Koshur Musalman, the Kashmiri Muslims, they are presented and depicted as threatening potential colonizers and outsiders who need to be removed from these lands, even if by force. So this is something that Fanon brings our attention to as well. And then there's another thing which is very relevant to us that Fanon talks about. Fanon chwana ke in the colonies, the official, the legitimate agent, the spokesperson for the colonizer and the regime of oppression is the police officer or the soldier. Matlab, you see police officer ya soldier cho asa, you should actual representative asa of the colonizer. Kashmir must agar tu bichu, yus army wol chu su asa zyad powerful in comparison to chief minister, in comparison to politicians, in comparison to the political establishment. It's because this army man is the actual agent of the colonizer in the colonized territory. You see, political establishment cha asa, it does not have the power to stop violence. The only power this political establishment has is to either commit violence, and the governments in Kashmir have done that, be that the NC government, the PDP government, they have committed violence against the masses and then justified committing violence. They can either commit violence or they can protect those who are committing it. That is, protecting the army man who, let's say, kills a Kashmiri boy, kills a Kashmiri girl, rapes a Kashmiri woman. So their job then is to protect this army man, pass laws that protect this army man. The judiciary, the job of the judiciary is to provide his act with a legal pretext. So this is how things work in colonialism, and this is something that Fanon brings our attention to. So Fanon believed that about violence, Fanon believed that Algeria was a favorable breeding ground for mental disorder. क्या was mental disorder? Because of colonial rule. If with Kashmir we see great decline in mental health. It's because of occupation. Now, it's a mistake if people think that occupation is just a political issue. Occupation is a social issue. It is a cultural issue. It's an economic issue. It's a personal issue. Because there is no part of our lives that the occupation does not affect. It affects our minds, let alone the external things in our lives. So, Fanon saw that Algeria was a breeding ground for mental disorder. So he suggested a category of psychiatric illnesses and he called them psychosomatic disorders. These disorders expressed that it is not necessary to be wounded by a bullet to suffer from the fact of war in body as well as in mind. Kashmir mein agar gool yeet in kaise, but occupation will affect your mind. It will affect the way you think, and it might even give you a mental disorder. It might even cause you depression. But that's not my main point. Post-revolutionary violence, when armed insurrection began in Algeria against colonialism, Fanon observed something very interesting. He saw that the patients he was seeing, they were freed from many of the symptoms of the mental disorder after getting involved in revolutionary violence. And it's not surprising when you consider the fact that the source of their mental disorder was the constant violence that they were facing at the hands of the colonizer. So for Fanon, if the masses lack consciousness and organization to fight back, then the violence and the aggression that gets developed in their minds as a result of constant violence and constant dehumanization, they use this violence against themselves, because every emotion, every repressed strong emotion needs release. It needs to be discharged. So Fanon believed that violence can have a therapeutic effect if people have catharsis, if people release this aggression against its source, which is the colonizer. So this is something that Fanon tells us. This is the psychiatric aspect of it. And then Fanon also says that at an individual level, violence is a cleansing force. It's because you see, colonized Shasa, after being subjected to constant dehumanization, after being reduced to subhuman level, after being treated like animals, this native develops an inferiority complex. It develops a passive and a despairing attitude. So Fanon observed that revolutionary violence, anti-colonial violence, emboldens the native and restores his self-confidence. Now, how exactly does violence help? So, for Fanon, first of all, violence should have very clearly and well-defined objectives. If it does not have well-defined objectives, then it can have negative impact instead of having a positive impact. But Fanon believes that violence begins its impact by subjecting the colonial master to fear. You see, colonial master Chuasa, this colonial master does everything to oppress the native. The Indian state has done everything in Kashmir to oppress the people of Kashmir. It has jailed them, it has killed them, it has raped their women, it has maimed their children. And as settler colonialism begins, it's going to take away their lands, it's going to take away their bread, it's going to take away their livelihood. Now, the rehabilitating value of violence lies in the equation that the colonized are ready to risk the only and the most precious thing they have, and the most precious thing they are left with, namely their life, for the sake of liberation. So this fear is created in the mind of the colonial master. This fear does more than suspending the assurance of the colonial master. Gwarche assurance makla. Assurance. You see, colonial master because I have subjected this native to constant oppression and violence, this native is not going to resist back. This native is he thinks that this native is going to get accustomed to violence and oppression, that he is going to succumb to it, that he is going to consider it as a fate that cannot be changed. When the native picks up arms, when the native takes recourse to violence, and when the native says to the colonizer that the only language you understand is that of force, because exactly this was said to the native. Indian state shona ke you see Koshur, the only language this Kashmiri understands is that of force. When the native picks up arms and uses violence against its source, then you see assurance shasa in the mind of the colonial lord it gets shattered. The illusions about the nature of the native, about the nature of the colonized, illusions shigasa shatter. It also inculcates in the colonial master the respect of that which prefers death to continued servitude. Fanon believes that those who profit by violence, those who have violence as their nature, they can be made to change only through greater violence. And you see, violence shows this also has another impact. Impact ki you see colonizer shows it promotes materialism and individualism in the natives. Materialism in the sense that it wants to turn the natives into careerists. It wants to make sure that there is no sense of brotherhood between the colonized, and the wallet is the only brother that an individual Kashmiri has. So it promotes materialism. That's why you see Indian state talking about employment, you see Indian state talking about education, you see Indian state talking about career, you see Indian state talking about Kashmiris being in Bollywood and Kashmiris being in Indian cricket teams and all of this. The Indian state does not care about Kashmiris. Everybody knows this. So why does the Indian state offer scholarships to Kashmiri students to study in India? Why does the Indian state promise employment and jobs to Kashmiris? It's because a material Kashmiri, a Kashmiri who only thinks about his individual material growth, is not going to think about the cause of liberation. Similarly, a Kashmiri who is addicted to drugs, why does the Indian state use drugs and alcohol as weapons of war? It's because a Kashmiri who is addicted to drugs, a Kashmiri who only thinks about how exactly can he get his hands on drugs, he's not going to think about putting an end to colonialism. Rather, this form of addiction or this need of drugs, he's going to use the colonial system to his own advantage to achieve drugs, to get his hands on drugs. And those who are material in their dispensation, those who follow materialism, they're also going to use colonial rule to their own advantage. And we have seen that people, indigenous elements within Kashmiri society, who use colonialism to their own material advantage and who seem to take advantage of the war to better their material situation. So this is something we have to keep in consideration. Fanon also talks about guerrilla fighters. He says that you see guerrilla fighter jo asa, the power of this guerrilla fighter rests in the fact that this guerrilla fighter is a representative of a social force immensely superior to their own numbers. Kashmir mas chui kuta relevant. You see guerrilla fighter jo asa Kashmir mas, the Indian state says that total ch akat pansa ya zahad guerrilla fighters in Kashmir. Every day we see a massacre of these fighters. Despite this fact, when you see an encounter that happens in Kashmir, the civilians rush to the encounter sites. Now, these civilians are many in numbers, and they rush to the encounter sites and they want to save this guerrilla fighter, or two guerrilla fighters, or three guerrilla fighters who are trapped. So why do so many people put their life on line for just two or three people? This is a question that may come into some people's minds. It's because these guerrilla fighters embody and represent the collective will of the masses, unarmed masses, to fight against slavery and to act against violent colonialism. So, you see, guerrilla fighter cho asa, native should samjhan ki this guerrilla fighter is not just an individual. He is a manifestation of the collective will of the people. And his life is the life of the masses. And his death is felt as one's own death by the people. So this is something that Fanon brings our attention to as well. Now, Fanon also talks about how appealing to the humanity of the colonizer will not work. Because he reminds us of the fact that you see, colonizer show asa, you shouldn't samjhe any insan native यस native छु यस समझा देमस इंसान के. We see that the Indian state does not consider Kashmiris as human beings. It treats them like animals. It uses pellet guns against them, pellet guns that are otherwise used to hunt animals. So, when you talk about appealing to the humanity of the colonizer, Fanon reminds us of the fact that it is useless to persuade the colonizer to end colonial oppression for the sake of humanity, since the colonizer denies the humanity of the colonized. So, even if Indians have humanity, even if the Indian state has humanity, Kashmiris are not a part of that. So this is something that Fanon brings our attention to. And then Fanon also talks about the appeal to common interests. We hear this in Kashmir often. People talking about common interests, a solution based on common interests. Fanon tells us that it's not enough for deoccupation that we talk about common interests. Common interests cannot change the social structure of occupation. It's because there is no commonality of interest. Our interest, the interest of Kashmiri Muslims, ya Kashmiris, lies in decolonization. It lies in complete deoccupation. It lies in freedom. This is our interest. Anything less than this is not our interest. It's a compromise. Now, the Indian state, on the other hand, the interest of the Indian state lies in the continuation of colonialism. It lies in the preservation of the colonialism. So, what commonality of interest are we talking about when we are two antagonist forces? When our interest lies in the destruction of the colonial system and their interest lies in the destruction of the colonized society. So, Fanon tells us that there can be no commonality of interests. So, this is something else that he brings our attention to. So, now we are going to talk about Fanon and Islam. So this is the only thing that I find problematic in Fanon's work. Fanon was very closely involved in Algerian struggle for liberation. And he was a part of Algerian National Liberation Front, as I said. Despite closely witnessing Algerian War of Independence, he does not make any mention of Islam throughout his works. Now it's a historical fact that Islam was central to Algeria's resistance to colonialism. And Algerian peasantry matlab yus kisan tabkos, yum danivawanis, yus ye tabkos, this was the lifeblood of Algeria's resistance to colonialism. And history tells us that this community, the community of peasants, they were not motivated by some Marxist or socialist or communist ideal. They were solely and completely motivated by Islam's anti-colonial tradition. And they believed that colonialism violated the foundation of Islam. They believed that colonialism violated the primal article of faith in Islam, which is that absolute submission in Islam should not be given to anything or anyone except God. But the colonial masters demanded complete submission. So how was one, when you read Fanon's description of Algerian revolution, some people get this idea that it was Marxist in nature. But you have to keep in consideration that when you talk about Marxist revolutionary theory or Marxist orthodoxy, it was always the proletariat who was the revolutionary class in the eyes of Karl Marx. Karl Marx himself gave little revolutionary significance to the peasantry. As I said, the peasantry led the Algerian War of Independence. Karl Marx believed that peasants were conservative and they lacked revolutionary consciousness. So, what exactly made the Algerian peasantry revolutionary? As I said, it was Islam, Islam's anti-colonial teachings, Islam's anti-colonial principles, and Islam's anti-colonial nature. In the 18th and 19th century North Africa, it was the Sufi Brotherhood, the Islamic clerical class, that championed resistance to colonization. And later, it was the Islamic Association of Scholars that led the cultural resistance against French colonization of Algeria. The rallying cry of the 1954 armed insurrection in Algeria was, "Islam is my religion, Arabic is my language, and Algeria is my country. So one should keep in mind that the Algerian revolution, Algerian resistance to colonialism it was not some atheistic or secular mode of salvation or secular mode of resistance. It was Islamic in its organization, it was Islamic in its culture, it was Islamic in its ideology, and even in its name. And it's an irony that the magazine for which Fanon used to write regularly, the official magazine of the National Liberation Front of Algeria, the name of this magazine was Al Mujahid. So it is important for us as Kashmiris to understand that we must not distort our struggle against colonialism to make it palatable to Western liberal audience. It has never helped anyone. It is not going to help us. So if Islam has a central and pivotal role in Kashmir's struggle against colonialism, then we should not obfuscate it. We should not weed out Islam from our discourse on Kashmir as well. So it's necessary for us to understand this, because the masses, they have religious sensibilities, and for them Islam is a very central part of our struggle against colonialism, and we see this in the slogans that are chanted. Now if someone says that people don't know what they're chanting, then they are espousing a sanctimonious attitude. People know what they're chanting, and one should not belittle people and their intellect. So we have to keep this in mind. And this was all for today. We would be talking about Fanon more in our upcoming podcasts. It's not possible to talk about all of what he says in a single podcast. I tried to put together some of the ideas. I hope you liked it. Inshallah, in the upcoming podcasts, we'll be talking about more of Fanon's ideas. Let us know your feedback on our Twitter page. Thank you so much for listening. Allah Hafiz.